Good evening, everyone, and allow me to welcome you to the Annapolis Maritime Museum's 2022 Virtual Winter Lecture Series. My name is Ted Birkinshaw, and I've been a member of the Annapolis Maritime Museum Board of Directors for about 10 years or so. And I have to tell you, what first got me interested in getting involved with the museum were the educational programs the museum had running for disadvantaged youth in the Annapolis community. We were providing an opportunity for some Annapolis kids to get outside and wade in the waters of the bay and interact with some of the critters that live below the surface. We were giving many of them their first experience on the water, despite their living within blocks of the bay. We continue to grow these programs as well as provide adult education programs such as this winter lecture series, all in keeping with the mission you see highlighted on the slide. I personally want to thank those of you who are AMM members for your support. The museum is no doubt a key part of the fabric of community in Annapolis. And as this picture shows, it is the coming together of our community and supporters like you that helped rescue our new exhibits from the recent flood. Please know that we have reopened our museum exhibits and that your membership entitles you to free admission. The Wilma Lee, which you see on the screen, but is also pictured behind me, is in Tillman Island, getting prepped for the start of her sailing season at the end of March. She loves to take people like you out for cruises, so please contact us if you're interested. Remember, if you're a member, you get a discount. Also, registration is now open for our very popular summer camps and schools out program, the schools out camps at our education center across Back Creek from the McNasby campus. And I'd have to tell you, all 4 of our grandchildren are going this summer, and 2 are going to be going for their 3rd summer. So we definitely like it. So before we begin, please take a moment to look at the bottom of your webinar screen, what's circled in yellow. You will see a Q&A button. Please submit any questions you have for our speaker through this feature during the lecture. The sooner you submit your question, the more likely it is that they will be answered, so don't wait until the end. We will be monitoring the questions as they come in, and we'll try our best to address as many as we can during the Q&A session. That'll be at the conclusion of the lecture. The chat button really is just a one-way button for us to use to share information with you tonight. If you're having any technical issues and need to contact us for assistance, please call Caitlin at 410-295-0104 at extension 19. Support for tonight's lecture is from JP Morgan. And we're very fortunate to have JP Morgan as our presenting sponsor this year. JP Morgan Private Bank has been serving families in Maryland, DC, and Virginia with their banking, lending, and wealth management needs for over 100 years. The greater Maryland community to which we belong is primarily served by a team of 17 professionals in Baltimore. Fellow Eastport resident David Thompson joined the team in 2020 to work with clients here in Annapolis and Southern Maryland. And you may not be able to tell, but David is with us tonight and is waving hello to all of you. It's great to welcome Homestead Gardens back again this year as our speaker sponsor. Homestead Gardens is a landmark nursery in Davidsonville, Maryland, and boasts the largest enclosed garden center in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. metropolitan areas. They also have a second location on Ritchie Highway in Severna Park. With the daffodils already coming up, you are going to want to get to know them sooner rather than later. Homestead Garden is a wonderful partner of AMM, supporting our programs and events. If you have not been to either location, I encourage you to stop by and check them out for your gardening needs. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Matthew C. Perry. I must admit, I was excited when I first saw that Matthew C. Perry was going to give one of our Winter Lecture Series lectures. It was proof that today's technology was finally able to make time travel real and not just a matter of fiction. I was pumped. I was looking forward to hearing a firsthand account of his adventures seen him dressed up in the military garbs of the mid-19th century. And when I came to the museum yesterday to meet him, I must say that initially I was a little disappointed. And yet, although I realized we didn't have the original Matthew C. Perry, the Commodore version, we had the next best person to tell his story, his namesake, the doctor version. So a little background. Dr. Perry is originally from Rhode Island, where as a child, he obtained an early interest in his ancestor, Commodore Matthew C. Perry, who negotiated a treaty of peace and amity between Japan and the United States in 1854. After graduating from college in 1963, he served in the US Navy aboard a ship in the Western Pacific Ocean and was involved with the first two amphibious landings in Vietnam. His ship made two memorable trips to Japan for R&R, and after 4 years of military service, he began a career in wildlife management and research, including 40 years at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland. But it's really what he has done over the last 10 years since retirement, getting back to his roots and his ancestor, that we will hear about tonight. So ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Matthew C. Perry.
Thanks a lot, Ted. I sure appreciate that nice introduction, and it's a pleasure for me to be here tonight in the museum at this beautiful setting. As a member, I certainly support the organization, the museum, and it's just great to be able to talk to you tonight. What I want to do is tell our audience about my ancestor, Commodore Matthew C. Perry, who's my great uncle, and I was named for him. And I heard a lot about him when I was a kid because my dad was quite proud of his work. So I'm going to tell a story from a family viewpoint. I'm a biologist, not a historian, but I've had a good amount of experience with him in recent years. But I want to start with talking about his family life and some of the aspects of his family that were so influential in his very successful career, which was culminated with the Treaty of Peace and Amity with Japan in 1854. So I'll start with these. This first slide shows Perry later in his career, how he was depicted in New York, but then also how the Japanese depicted him when he went to Japan. And this painting, which was on one of the scrolls, was fairly complimentary because the earlier one was showing him as a barbarian with red hair and a long red beard, and it was quite startling to see some of these images of him. His father was Captain Christopher Raymond Perry, and he was the father of both Commodores, because the person I'm also going to talk about briefly is his older brother, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, who was very successful on the Great Lakes, the Battle of Lake Erie in the War of 1812, when he defeated the British, and I'll talk more about that. But get back to the father. Captain Christopher Raymond was originally a Quaker, but during the Revolutionary War, he changed that dramatically and became a fighter in the American Revolution. He was very much opposed to the British tax system and some of the things that Americans were going through in the early years. He was captured twice by the British and was imprisoned off the Ireland coast in one of their prisoner ships. But because he was an officer, he was given parole, and he made friends with local people. And it was during that period that set sort of the course for his life, because he met his future wife, Sarah Wallace Alexander. And she was a descendant from William Wallace. William Wallace didn't have any direct descendants, but she was descended from one of his brothers, and he was the man that fought the English for so many years. And when he was finally captured, refused to repent. They tortured him and eventually killed him. And then the Wallace family wasn't too welcome in Scotland any longer, and that's when they moved to Ireland. So it was many generations later when Perry was in Ireland in a prisoner ship when he met Sarah Wallace. And the interesting story about her, and by the way, we don't have any portraits of her that I know of, it's just this silhouette, was that her parents had just died in Ireland, and she was being sent to America, to Philadelphia, to live with her aunt and uncle. So she was a 16-year-old orphan when she met Christopher Perry, who was 21 at the time. They met in Ireland, and they left Ireland for the USA in 1781. This was after his second prisoner imprisonment in Ireland, and they met on the ship going back. Well, when they arrived in the United States in Philadelphia, she was to learn that her aunt and uncle, who she was going to stay with, were also dead from the flu epidemic. And they were making plans for this young girl to go back to Ireland. Well, during the trip over, as you might have guessed, Raymond and Sarah Wallace fell in love. And when they talked about her going back to Ireland, Christopher said, "No, you can't do that. I love her. She loves me. We want to get married." So the person that was chaperoning her, bringing her to the country, was in a real bind of what to do because she was only 16 years old. But he finally agreed to their pleas. They were married quickly that night. And then because of the pandemic, they got out of town real fast and headed for Rhode Island, where Christopher was from. So that's when they began their life up there. And they had 8 children. The first child was Oliver Hazard, and then Raymond Henry Jones. Now, Raymond Henry Jones is the one I'm descended from. So I don't come in a direct line from either one of the Commodores, but Raymond was a captain. And although he only had a very short life, he was fairly successful and no problems in his life. And he was a captain in the Navy. The next child, a third child, was also fairly well known because she married Commodore Rogers' daughter. And this was, Commodore Rogers was a friend of Captain Perry. And so it was interesting that this early relationship between the Perrys and the Rogers, who are huge names in naval history, and especially at the Naval Academy here in Annapolis, that these families came together early. And then the fourth child is Matthew Calbreth. And I have to tell a quick story about how he got that name. The person that was chaperoning Sarah Wallace when she came to this country, his name was Mr. Calbreth. I forget his first name, but his last name was Calbreth. Well, he had a 10-year-old son named Matthew Calbreth. And so Sarah and Christopher were so impressed with this young boy, they named their fourth child for Matthew Calbreth and gave him the name Matthew Calbreth Perry. And so that's how that happened. Now, the other 4 children were all successful. The main one that I'll talk about briefly about is James Alexander, because he had a very short life and was involved with the War of 1812. Well, let's talk briefly about Oliver Hazard, because his fame, because of the 1812 War of 1812, really helped the Perry family. I mean, Christopher was fairly well known because of the Revolution, but this second Revolutionary War was so important in sealing our northern borders. And with the Battle of Lake Erie, Perry was able to turn the tides on the British with his stunning victory up there. And it's fairly well known in the history books, but I'll just go over it briefly. He was sent to Erie, Pennsylvania, and there he built a squadron of ships to face the British. The British were on the other end of the bay defending Fort Detroit, which they controlled at that time. And it was this relationship, this fast shipbuilding, that made Perry so famous, because he was totally involved with it. The ships finally got across the sandbar, which the British Navy never thought they were going to do, but they got across the bar and they floated down to Sandusky area in Ohio, and there they met the British on September 10th, 1813, 1 year after the war had started. And the famous battle occurred there, and that's when Perry beat the British and made a big change in the war. This is one of the probably more accurate displays of Perry leaving the ship. There's several errors here. First of all, and the family loves to tell the story, because when you're leaving a ship, he took the flag, which was his battle flag, "Don't give up the ship," but he did not lower the American flag. And they show the American flag on this boat. He did take 4 men with him, so that part is true. It wasn't rough waters. In fact, the problem that he had with his ship, the Lawrence, was that it was very becalmed and they were having trouble maneuvering. And of course, he wouldn't have been standing up, because at that time they had snipers in the enemy ships, and they certainly would have gone for the captain as quickly as possible. But after the war, after the battle, just in one day, he sent the famous message to General Harrison, who was waiting, trying to take over Fort Detroit. And he said, We have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect and esteem, O.H. Perry. And it was that message that was made him so famous, and it was the first time a complete British squadron had been defeated in battle. This is the another famous painting of Perry. Here it's a little more exaggerated because they're showing rough seas, the American flag, him standing up, and then also his young brother who's only 12 years old by his side. It's pretty well documented that the boy, James Alexander, was not with Perry when he moved from the Lawrence to the Niagara, and he was asleep. They still had the flag up, but right after Perry was securely on the Niagara, they surrendered the ship, which of course would have protected the young boy and the rest of the ship from any damage, because they were getting bombarded pretty badly. And also they only had 4 men when they rowed to the Niagara. Now I want to divert a bit and talk about a person that I'm descended from. This is the Honorable James DeWolf. He was a major slave trader. At one time, he was considered the 2nd wealthiest man in the country. He was from my hometown of Bristol, Rhode Island, and he was the father of Mary Ann DeWolf. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in Rhode Island at that time. And so he plays an important part, mainly because he was a slave trader. And I'm going to talk more about the slave trade later. But he became a senator because he was so influential in Rhode Island because of the huge wealth that he had and the influence. One of the reasons he wanted to be a senator was because he didn't want any laws against slave trading. He was making a fortune and he wanted it to continue. This is the mansion he built in my hometown. It was called the Mount, and it was a beautiful display of affluence at that time. And he had all the walls hand painted with scenes from his slave plantations in Cuba and in other areas. But it was in this room and in this mansion where he put on a huge party for Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, the winner of the Battle of Lake Erie, because he was so happy that the British had been defeated, and by the son of his good friend, Christopher Raymond. Well, it was at this party that he put on that his younger brother, Raymond Henry Jones Perry, met James DeWolf's daughter. So here's Lieutenant Commander Raymond Henry Jones Perry that I'm descended from, the brother of the Commodores, and here's the woman he met at that party, Mary Ann DeWolf, who became his wife. So that's part of the story, and that's why they both lived in Bristol, my hometown of Rhode Island. And I'm not sure exactly where they live, but I've been tracing down some of the homes in that town, trying to learn more about it. So that gives you a little background on the relationship that affected Matthew Perry later in life when he was involved with trying to stop slave trade, because people thought he had a conflict of interest because his brother was married to the daughter of the wealthiest slave trader in New England at that time. So I'll give you a little history on Matthew's career. He started under his father's tutelage, became a midshipman in 1809. He then became, and at that time, you know, you didn't go to college or get educated. Most of the people didn't. And if you were the son of a captain of the Navy, you went to sea. He became a lieutenant in 1813, a master of commandant in 1826, and then a captain in 1837. And he was, at that time, when he was captain, he was also promoted to Commodore. Now, they didn't have any rank of admiral at that time. Commodore was a position that was for any captain who had 2 commands. And he had 2 commands, and I'll talk about that later. But this is a portrait of him in 1835 by Mount, and this is the one that's at the Naval Academy in their portrait gallery. This is his wife that he married, Jane Slidell, married her in December, Christmas Day, 1814. Now, she had a tremendous relationship with Matthew. They were very sincerely in love for a long time and had 10 children, 2 more than his father had. But 3 of them died within 1 year. John Slidell, who was named for her father, died after 1 year. And then also Susan died after 1 year. And also the last child that she had, Anna, died after 1 year. So 3 children died early in their life, 1 male and 2 females. That left 3 males, Matthew, Oliver, and Matthew Jr., Oliver Hazard, and then William. And so these three males all had successful lives, but they weren't as famous as their uncles and their father. But the four women who married very well in life, they helped their father and their family tremendously. Sarah married Robert Rogers, who was the son of Commodore Rogers, and that was a big Navy family. And then the other one that was very important was Jane Oliver Hazard Perry, and she married John Hone, who was a big financier, diarist in New York City. Caroline Perry married August Belmont, and August Belmont, as you probably know, I'll talk more about him later. He was a major financier, wealthy banker in Europe and also in the United States, and had a lot of luck in the banking field, made a lot of money, and was helpful to his father-in-law later in life. And the last one that was very successful was Isabella Bolton. She married George Tiffany, who was the cousin of the man who started Tiffany Jewelry in New York City. So the family had a lot of money. So I just bring that up because at that time, women didn't have education either, but they also didn't have anywhere near the advantages that the men had. And so their role in life, and it's also the role of the males, was to find them a good husband. Well, their father and their brothers did a good job because they all married well and they all helped the family financially. Here's John Slidell. He was the father of Jane and a very wealthy man, as I stated. And then when he died, Jane received a good inheritance, which helped the Commodore later in life to lead the life that they really needed to lead as captains in New York City. So they were up in the high society and living pretty well in New York City at the time. So now I want to talk a little bit about Matthew's sea adventures. In 1821 to 1823, he was commander of the USS Shark in the West Indies. He was hunting pirates. Pirates were a major problem down in the Caribbean at that time because they were hiding out and getting protection in Puerto Rico and in Cuba and a lot of the other islands. They had very small but very fast ships, and they would come out of their harbors and then take prisoners, kill a lot of the people on board the ships, and then take all the valuable things on the ship and sometimes take over the ship. This was one of the bad, this portrait of the ship is a bad incident that they had off in the Caribbean. You can see if you look carefully on the left, this is a water spout that was very rare, but this is a major water spout that was at sea. So the men were on the mast, on the booms, taking down the sail very rapidly. Can you imagine the feeling of that was? All these men scattered on the mast, trying to get the sails down because this wind had come up so fast. So that was a major experience for Commodore Perry commanding the ship for 3 years. But one of the big things he did that year was he, under the direction of the Secretary of the Navy, he went to Key West, Florida, which had a different name at that time, and took possession of it in 1822. The United States had just taken possession of Florida, but the Keys were not decided upon. And there was a lot of confusion whether Spain still owned the Keys or whether Cuba did. Cuba suggested they own it. Turned out Cuba eventually sold the land, Key West land, to a Cuban who turned it around in a year and sold it to an American. After the Americans owned the land, Key West, the island, they sent word to Washington that they needed more protection. So they welcomed Lieutenant Perry on the Shark coming in and planting the flag in Key West, claiming it for the United States. In 1824 to 1827, Lieutenant Perry got his first big advance beyond the squadron, the Mediterranean squadron, and he was stationed on North Carolina as a first lieutenant. This gave him a lot of opportunities to learn what it was like to sail on bigger ships and in the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean at that time was also ravaged with pirates. And so that was one of the main things they were doing, chasing pirate ships and trying to protect the Mediterranean and our European allies, but also doing a lot of diplomatic work at that time, which was something that Matthew Perry found very easily to do and right to his liking. He was a very friendly person, very firm, but a diplomatic person, and he enjoyed diplomacy. He did not like fighting so much, but he wanted to work things out peacefully. He made a second cruise to the Mediterranean as captain of the USS Concord. So now this is a big step up for him because he's now got command of his own ship. But at that time, there was a big problem that he had with our government because we had the policy of using the Navy at that time to transport dignitaries wherever they wanted to go. And Perry had the unfortunate role of taking John Randolph to Russia. He was from Virginia, and he was the new minister to Russia that the United States was establishing. So Perry wasn't too excited about this, but he was told by his commander-in-chief to take John Randolph to Russia. Well, John was a very cantankerous man. He once said he hated Yankees. Perry was from Rhode Island, and he certainly made it a personal attack on Perry that he didn't like any Yankees. But he went further. He said, I don't like any people from states other than Virginia. And then he took it one step further, and he said, you know, I don't really like very many people in Virginia. So this is the type of personality that Perry was dealing with, and he started ordering Perry around. And at that time, he had the right to direct where the ship went. So he wanted to stop in England, Ireland, Scotland, and many other areas to see friends of his, and he was wasting a lot of Perry's time. And one of the last things that really caused a problem between them was he had traveled about 20 miles upriver and was visiting some friends, and he wanted Perry to take his ship up there and pick him up because he was ready to leave. Well, the river was not deep enough, and Perry refused on safety reasons. Well, he sent a nasty letter back to Washington, and then Perry had written a couple of letters back on saying the safety reasons he couldn't do it, and so this went back and forth. But eventually, he did get to Russia and got rid of John Randolph. But that wasn't the end of the problems. There was still some dealings to do with Lady Jane Franklin. Now, Jane Franklin was the wife of John Franklin, who was famous for traveling in the northern areas of Canada, searching for the Northwest Passage, and also searching for new rivers that would get across the continent. So he was very famous in England. Jane wanted to go to Turkey because at that time he was helping the Turks, the Greeks. He wanted to go to Greece because and in Turkey because they were having a war together, and she wanted to join her husband there. Later on, John Franklin was on Commodore Perry's board. They became very good friends. And as you probably know, John Franklin finally made a last journey. Jane Franklin was never too happy. She always wanted her husband to be a little more successful, and she pushed him in later life to try to find the Northwest Passage. And this was his crucial mistake because they thought they could do it this time because they had new provisions that they could make it through the long, cold winters. But that's when John Franklin died. His whole crew died in the Arctic, and the search for him went on for years. Jane Franklin helped organize and pay for many missions trying to find her husband. But he finally dropped her off, and then he could finish his cruise and head back home. And then he started a long period of shore duty at the New York Navy Yard. At that time, he was in charge of all recruiting, and the big Navy yards, that's what their responsibility was. He had done it in Boston, and he was now doing it in New York. But in New York, he became really excited about the education of sailors and also of officers. He created the Lyceum, which was the beginning of adult education. And he asked all captains of ships to bring back information, books and artifacts from all the countries they visited. And they started building up this huge museum at the New York Navy Yard. He was also interested in steam power. A lot of the old salts were against that because they said it would never be possible to run ships by steam power. Perry felt it could be done, worked with Fulton, who was the designer of steam engine, and designed the first boat that could be powered by steam. You got to realize that Fulton was really the mastermind behind steam power, but Perry was the mastermind behind powering ships at sea. So Perry's considered the father of the steam navy. The other thing he was heavily involved with was lighthouses. This was because of his time around the Keys that were very dangerous because they had a large reef about 8 miles from the shoreline, from all the islands. A lot of sailors in that area weren't aware of the reef, and they went aground. And at that time, there were wreckers throughout the islands that could come up on the ship and take everything that was there. The idea was to try to save the crew, but the wrecking industry went huge. And at one time, Key West was the wealthiest city in the whole country because of all the wreckers that were there, benefiting from these poor sailors that were going aground. And in many cases, the wreckers were actually moving buoys and light areas so that the ships would go aground. So Perry saw this, he was upset, he petitioned Congress and the White House to do something about it. And that started the first lighthouses off the Keys. And then, of course, they spread throughout the whole coast of the United States. He was for discipline. He was a big disciplinarian, and he felt flogging was okay. We went through a long period where the country was against flogging and also against the grog. And these two things actually went together because the Navy was having trouble getting recruits. It helped if you could offer them grog. That was their daily ration of rum. But because they were drinking rum, they also got into fights and caused problems, and then you needed flogging. So it went back and forth like that until 1850, when the United States government finally outlawed flogging. They had outlawed grog before that time, something that the British government kept going for a long time, including my time in the Navy. So this is Alexander Slidell Mackenzie, an interesting fellow because he was Jane's brother. And so he's Matthew Perry's brother-in-law. His last name should have been Slidell, but for some reason he didn't like it and took his mother's last name. So he was now Alexander Slidell Mackenzie. He was a big author of many books. And at that time, if you were an educated author, you weren't considered to get too much respect from sailors. Sailors liked officers that came up through the ranks and learned their trade at sea. But Commodore Perry, at that time at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, was so big on education, he designed this idea to have a ship take midshipmen on a cruise to the Mediterranean. And there they would get educated at all the great institutions throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Mediterranean, and they'd also learn shipboard skills. Everything was going fine. They went over there on the idea that they had to give mail to one of the ships. When they got in the Mediterranean and stopped at several ports, they learned that the ship had already gone back to the United States. So they ended their cruise in the Mediterranean and headed back to the United States. Aboard the ship at that time was a 19-year-old boy named Philip Spencer. Philip had a reputation of being a real troublemaker on other ships when he started out as a young midshipman, and he was a very privileged lad who was nothing but trouble. Mackenzie did not want to take Philip Spencer because he had the right to reject all the people. But Commodore Perry made a major mistake by telling Mackenzie to take Philip because he was convinced that the cruise to the Mediterranean would straighten out this boy and he would start being a good sailor. And this was just what the Navy needed. Well, Philip was the son of John Spencer, who at that time was President John Tyler's Secretary of War. So we're dealing with some pretty influential people here. He was also the grandson of Ambrose Spencer, politician and a lawyer from New York. Well, Philip was a little hot-headed, and he had this idea of piracy. He colluded with two senior bosun mates on the ship, both of them in their 30s. He's only 19, but they were in their 30s. They planned a mutiny on the ship when they were heading back to the United States because they wanted to go to the Caribbean and be pirates and get a lot of money and also have women at their disposal, because at that time they were killing all the males on board and then taking the women that were on any ships for their own pleasure. So it was a real bad time. Mackenzie was extremely distressed when he received word from one of the seamen that this plot was actually going to happen. Mackenzie called Philip in. He confessed to the idea that he was going to create a mutiny, which totally irritated Mackenzie, and he had him put in chains on the deck. He also found out by searching his luggage, that he had laid out plans with these other two men to have a mutiny. They were going to kill the captain, all officers, and then throw any men that didn't want to be part of the mutiny and go become pirates overboard. So it was going to be a mass mutiny. Well, the other two men were also chained on deck. They had no brig at that time, and what was happening was they continued to get discontent on the ship, and there was more and more talk about having a mutiny. They were 5 days out of the United States when they finally had a trial for these three men, and the people that were involved with the trial were two of Perry's relatives. Perry, again, is not on the ship. He's back in Brooklyn. Mackenzie, and then also a descendant of John Rogers, the Commodore. So you've got some very influential people that all agreed that these three men were guilty, and they decided that they should be hanged for mutiny as midshipmen aboard the Somers. And that occurred on December 1st, 1842. And it was a tragic thing to happen at that time. But Mackenzie was so worried that he could not get to the ship to the United States without a mutiny and being killed himself, that he took this action. Mackenzie was a religious man. He had the men pulled to their hanging spot by midshipmen on the ship. And then after they were dead in 3 minutes, he lowered them, wrapped them in canvas, had a major religious service that all hands attended, and then the men were tossed overboard very ceremoniously and in a religious fashion. But that was the end of what became known as the Somers Incident. And if you look that up in any history books or Wikipedia, you'll find out that that was one of the darkest days in our Navy history. And it was sometimes equated to the assassination of President Lincoln, because it was such a tragic turning point in our country's history. But it was also a proving point that the Navy needed better education, and Perry was pushing for a naval academy for a long time, and now there was finally some action being taken along that line, because training midshipmen in sea was just not working out successfully. So in 1843 to 1845, Perry was involved with bringing slaves back to Africa that had been freed. This is why I was telling you about the conflict of interest he had with his brother, who had married the daughter of the slave trader that I'm descended from. Perry was doing two things. He was bringing people, freed slaves, back to Africa. At the same time, he was stopping any ships that were carrying slaves back to the Caribbean and other areas, and also throughout Europe. The United States had already outlawed slave trading. Of course, slavery went on, of course, until after the middle of the Civil War, but slave trading had been ended. Perry was trying to find ships that were flying the American flag, but no ships would be flying the American flag at that time because it was outlawed. So they would get another country that they would license their ship with. The first people that he brought over to the coast of Africa, it was a horrible failure. There were tribes all along the coast that were catching Africans, and so these poor people didn't know what they were getting into. They had to run for their lives, and they also had to fear yellow fever and malaria that was rampant on the coast that they had not been familiar with in the United States. Eventually, the area of Liberia was settled and by several countries, and that became the beginning of a returning of slaves. And also the major city in that area was Monrovia, named for President Monroe, who had started the original idea of returning freed slaves to the United States. So this is where Perry learned a lot, because he spent several years off the coast. He was very concerned about disease. They had this problem with malaria and yellow fever. No one knew it was transmitted by the mosquito. That wasn't determined until later on when they were building the Panama Canal. But Perry knew that it had something to do with being near land. So he kept men on the ship away from land, and also gave great ventilation. The other thing, they thought it was fumes coming from the hull of the ship. But it turns out that they never did find it. But one of his big findings at that time was the problem with scurvy, which was another problem that all sailors had to face when they went to sea. And no one knew what was causing scurvy at that time. Perry wrote in his journal, "The cause of scurvy is malnutrition. The entire class of crucifers, these are the mustards, the huge family of plants, seeing in them the cross of health in the crusade against the scorbutic taint." So the cross of health is a reference to the fact that crucifers have 4 petals in the shape of a cross. And it's this major family of plants that was so high in the vitamins, in the minerals, that prevented scurvy. So this was a big finding, and that's when people started having a lot more vegetables and greens at sea. And that's when the English got their term limeys, because they always had lime when they went to sea. And they were the first ones that started properly protecting themselves from scurvy. Perry was also involved with the Mexican War, because at this time, the United States was having trouble with Mexico over Texas. And Texas had become a territory, but Mexico claimed it. So Perry went down there and was involved with several raids on the country. You can see him in a ship here, in a barge. He's going ashore, following his men up the coast. He'd come down in his favorite ship, which had just been finished in 1942. This is the Mississippi. It was one of the first steamships that he supervised the construction of. This is the stern end. You can see the 2 wheels here, the water wheels, and you can see snipers standing on top, shooting at the Mexicans ashore. So they went in, they had several raids, and after these several raids, he was successful in winning the battles, and he had the Mississippi as a steam power as a backup. He brought many cannons back. If you go to the Naval Academy, right in front of McCullough Hall, you'll see a lot of these cannons that are in that area. Now I want to talk another little diversion, because it's important in regards to Perry's trips to Japan. And this is the John Howland. This is a whaling ship out of New Bedford, and it was captained by Captain Whitfield, and I'll talk about him in a little while. But I want to talk about 4 major events that were important in regards to Perry being successful with his negotiations with Japan. The first American that was actually made landfall in Japan was John Kendrick. There's been several books written about him. He was a major fur trader. He was taking furs from the northwest coast of the United States to China and other areas. But he stopped in Japan, went ashore, got some supplies and water. Then the Japanese told him they had to leave real fast, because nobody could go to Japan at that time, and the samurai were going to come, and everybody would be killed. The next mission of anybody going to Japan was the Morrison. That was the name of a ship. It was a trader ship out of China. They had some Japanese that they wanted to return to Japan, and the ship went in totally unarmed. The Japanese fired at the ship, and the Morrison left very rapidly without leaving any of the Japanese there. The third one is William Whitfield. This is the commander of the Howland. Now, this is an important aspect of the whole Japan-American relationships, because William Whitfield found 5 people that had been stranded a long distance from Japan on an island. Their boat had drifted away in a storm, and they got caught in a current, and they went way south of Japan. He took these 5 men back to Hawaii, which at that time was called the Sandwich Islands, and he had befriended the youngest. His name was Manjiro. He had one name, and Manjiro was 14 years old, and Whitfield convinced him to come back to New Bedford, his hometown of Fairhaven, right next to New Bedford, and this is where he was educated. I'll talk more about Manjiro in a second, but I just mentioned the last important thing was James Biddle. Biddle went to Japan on a mission to also open to Japan to trade. He was very unsuccessful. He asked the commissioners to come on board and talk with him. They said, no, you come on shore. When he tried to go on shore, they pushed him back from the boat that they were going to pick him up with. No one at that time would ever attack an officer. That was capital punishment by hanging. And so the American honor was greatly affected by this incident. And Perry knew about it, our government knew about it, and we were very upset of the way Americans were being treated in Japan. This is Captain Whitfield, the commander of the John Howland, and he was the one that picked up Manjiro in 1842. He was educated in the United States. He actually changed his religion because at that time they wanted Asians to sit in the back of the church or up in the balcony with the colored people, the black people at that time. But he refused and he changed his religion and he joined another church in town that tolerated Asians and Black Americans. But then he assisted with Manjiro's return. So that was in 1852. Manjiro had been part of the gold rush in California. He had been a whaler. He got educated with English, and he was a very sharp person that was creating quite a life for himself. The Whitfield home is in Fairhaven. It's now preserved, and it's part of a friendship society. And if you're interested in what they do in regards to Japanese-American relations, I strongly recommend you contact them. Manjiro, like I said, he had one name. Later on in life, but when he got back into Japan, he took on two names. The second name was from his hometown, Nakahama. The Navy called him, the men on the ship, the sailors called him John Mung because they couldn't pronounce his name, Manjiro. He was rescued in 1841 and returned in 1852. At that time, when he was going back, it was the Sakoku period. This is when no Japanese could go abroad. Only small ships could be built. No Japanese ships could be returned. So if you left Japan, that was it. You could not go back. And no foreigners would be tolerated. And this was the time when some of our whaling ships were running aground or getting blown against Japan coast, and they were being mistreated by the Japanese. Our government was very upset about this, and so was Commodore Perry at that time. This is where the island on the left is the drawing that Manjiro made of his island, Torishima. Tori is bird, because it's called Bird Island, and it was drawn by Manjiro. On the right is what the island looks like today. It's a tremendous colony for short-tailed albatrosses, and that's where the United States works closely with ornithologists in Japan, studying the black-tailed, short-tailed albatross along with other birds. This is where Torishima is located. You can see it's 370 miles south of Tokyo, so it's a long distance from the city. Manjiro's journal was written in Japanese, but it wasn't until the early 2000 that it was finally translated by these two men. And I had the real pleasure to meet them in 2003 when their book was dedicated in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And these are the two translators that took Manjiro's journal, and now it's a easy book to get in English. At the beginning of Perry's trip to Japan, this is what he looked like. This is a silhouette they took of him. He was commander of what was called the East India Squadron Expedition to Japan. Perry had done a lot of writing in a whole year period. He spent a whole year studying the Japanese, and he went to New Bedford and asked about the Japanese boy from the Sandwich Islands. He knew about Manjiro, but Manjiro was already gone, and he was heading back to Japan. But in secret letters and also in some newspaper articles I found in very, very small articles, because Perry wanted it to be quiet. He didn't want anyone to know he was going to Japan, mainly because the English and the Russians also wanted to go to Japan and be successful in opening up trade with Japan. This is Perry's mission across Norfolk, beginning in November 1852, when he went across the Atlantic, then around Africa, around India through the Indian Ocean, and then eventually coming into the Pacific Ocean, with stops all along the way in Singapore and Hong Kong, Shanghai, and then going to Naha. Naha is now Okinawa, where he set up camp, and he actually made a trial run of what it was going to be like when he arrived in what he thought was Edo Bay, which is now Tokyo Bay, when he arrived in Japan. He made one trip to Bonin Islands because that's where Americans and English had settled. And so there was a colony there of English-speaking people who had owned land, and he knew about that, and he thought it'd be a good place to make a coal storage. So he went there, and he didn't have the money from the government. He always complained about the government not giving him enough money, but he took 50 of his own dollars and purchased 50 acres of land from this New England descendant, New England man, Nathaniel Savory, and his descendants still live there. So just want to talk about the other part of the mission. This is his ship going across the flagship on the Mississippi. This is another picture of Madeira, in Madeira, where he picked up a lot of supplies because he loved wine and he thought it was important in regards to negotiations. He went into Edo Bay at Uraga in July 8, 1853. They explored the depths of this area because he wanted to find the deepest areas where he could bring his ships. Japanese officials came out and told them they had to depart, leave immediately, go away, do not dare to anchor, and then one said, I can speak Dutch. This was a major thing because the Dutch was the language that they used most frequently there. He landed in Kuriyama and then delivered the letter to my great and good friend at that time, the Japanese. We didn't know who was running Japan. He left and spent the winter in China, but then returned the next year. He had gotten word that the British and the English wanted to go to Japan. I mean, the English and the Russians, and he wanted to beat them there. He went there, and under great fanfare, he brought in 8 ships this time and was really successful in bringing the power and the power that he had on the people. This is a tree that was in that last painting. It's still there, and I visited that area. This is Perry coming into Japan and negotiating with the people in 1854 when he came back. He gave a lot of gifts. They didn't know about railroad power. He gave them a locomotive and tracks, and also told them about the telegraph. They didn't know about the telegraph. You can see the telegraph in the background here. They tried to get a man to outrun it, but it wasn't possible. So they had a lot of gifts for him. The commissioners actually rode the train around the track they had, and it showed the power. Then he had a big reception for them on the Powhatan, which was his flagship at that time. You can see the canvas over the top of the upper deck. And at that time, there was quite a bit of drinking of Kentucky bourbon. And he brought a lot of Kentucky bourbon with him. And then one of the commissioners in Japan finally stood up and said, Japan and America, all the same heart. And everybody was cheering because they thought they had finally had this friendly relationship. And then Perry said, leaned over and told his aide, says, oh, if they just signed the treaty, he may kiss me. And then they had a big banquet on shore. The Japanese entertained Perry. They had sumo wrestling, and then the treaty was finally signed on March 31st. The treaty called for peace and friendship between the United States and Japan, opening 2 ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, assistance with wrecked ships and protection of shipmates, and Japan was going to supply coal, water, and other provisions, but we'd pay for it. The Japanese commissioners had succeeded because they didn't let Perry go to any port. They had shielded the shogun and emperor, which were both very ineffective at that time and very young. They prevented Perry from entering Edo, Tokyo, and they had maintained peace. There was only one problem. The treaty was written in 3 languages, English, Dutch, and Chinese. There was one word that differed, and that was the word either or both. The United States thought they could set up a council in Japan if either country wanted one. Japanese said no, both countries had to agree, and Japan wasn't going to agree. That's what took Townsend Harrison so long to establish a council in Shimoda, but he finally was successful. After the treaty was signed, he went to Shimoda, was very friendly at that time. He said, Shimoda shows advanced state of civilization, much beyond our own boasted progress in the attention to cleanliness and healthfulness. He was very interested in cleanliness, and as you probably all know, the Japanese are very clean people. They also allowed Perry to bury one of his shipmates there who had died from a tragic fall. This was the first time there'd been any Christian ceremony in Japan in over 250 years. And Perry asked that the Buddhist Shinto priests assist in the ceremony. And so it was a good chance for both religions to work together in the burial of this man. Americans then did a lot of collecting of animals, and this was done with the shotguns they had at that time. Great number of pellets. The Japanese had never seen this because they were still using matchlock rifles, which they had gotten from the Portuguese. And of course, there wasn't that much hunting going on anyhow because of the Buddhist view against taking a life. Two men tried to go back with Perry, and they got on the ship. They boarded the ship, but Perry refused their passage. They both ended up in jail when they got back on land. One was freed. Yoshida was freed in 2 years, but Kaneko died after a short time in jail. When I visited Hagi, the town that these men were from, I met the descendant of Kaneko, and we had a great friendly relationship. Perry then went to Hakodate in Hokkaido, and he was surprised that some of the women were still hiding in homes. They wouldn't let the women out. They gave him a block of granite for the Washington Monument for the American king that they knew of. This is what Perry looked like when he finished the journey in 1854. And the sailor said, "I'll say a man walks straight on that crack, he'd get a good squaw treatment. But if he got off it, that crack, Lord have mercy on him." And that's the way the sailors looked at Perry. He went overland to go home to the United States, stopped at The Hague to visit August Belmont and his new grandson named August Belmont Jr. And this is his daughter, Caroline, seated at the far left next to August Belmont. And his wife is holding one of the other grandchildren. And of course, Belmont was famous for the Belmont Stakes, which goes on every year. Perry wrote 3 narratives, 3 volumes of his narrative. He wanted some famous authors to do it, but they all declined because they were too busy. He finally had the rector of his church, Francis Hawkes, do the writing of his narrative. There was one scene in there that Congress didn't like, and that's this nude scene of the public bath in Shimoda. So there's only about 50 copies of that narrative that have this picture in it. The copy I have doesn't have that picture that was taken out. But they also have some beautiful paintings that were taken throughout the trip. There was one fish that was named for Perry, and then they also did a lot of bird collecting to bring back to the scientists of the United States. Perry received a medal from the Merchants of Boston, and it was taken from this silhouette picture of him. This is what he looked. This is a photograph, a daguerreotype photograph in 1855, just before he died, 1858, at the age of 64. He was first buried in New York City, but then moved to Newport, Rhode Island, and the wishes of his daughter, Caroline, and her husband, August Belmont. And this is in Newport, his monument in Newport. In 1860, the Japanese sent a ship to the United States with samurai. They had purchased this ship from the Dutch, and you can see it had a propeller, no side-wheeling steam engines. The revolution continued in Japan. There was a lot of unrest between the samurai and the emperor, and the emperor finally got control after a long period of samurai rule. And this, of course, is displayed in talked about in the movie Last Samurai. But the shogun finally resigned in 1867. An emperor came in. He was only 15 years old at the time. This picture, of course, is when he's a lot older. And this is where Japan went through a major industrialization. They did recognize Perry in 1903 at the 100th anniversary of going to Japan. And this monument is at Kurihama. There's a lot of tourists that came to Japan at that time, and also tourists came to the United States. But then we went through a period of immigrants, and we stopped them coming in. And of course, then Japan became so industrialized, they moved into China and started becoming very militaristic. My family was involved with a peace treaty in 1939, and they brought in descendants of Captain Whitfield and also descendants of Manjaro. And the ambassador Grew was married to a granddaughter of Commodore Perry at that time. But of course, it wasn't successful. We went to war, and then after a long, bitter war, MacArthur read the peace conditions. At the same time, he had asked for the flag that Perry had aboard his ship, and that came from the Naval Academy and displayed in the background of all the other officers, all the Allied officers that were with him. In 1953, only a year after occupation had ended, I was involved as a young boy with a consul general from Japan, with Mayor Dean in Newport placing a wreath on Perry's grave. And they said, the two brothers, Perry of the Lakes and Perry of Japan, sleep in God near the beloved mother of whose bosom they first learned the worth of life. Also laid a wreath at his statue. This is the largest statue of him in the United States. And then this is the platter that was made by the Tiffany Company, and I had the honor to give that to the captain of the ship. I've been involved with a lot of grassroots episodes, and we have tried to maintain this good relationships with Japan. This is a scroll I discovered in Japan. They had portrayed Perry in a lot of different ways, and they all weren't correct, especially the way we row a boat. And I had some fun talking to the historians about that. We also gave Japan a bust of Commodore Perry, and this is when it's being received in Japan. And I had two Japanese historian friends, and we finally tracked it down in a park in Kampai. And that was the way we ended up our relationship in Japan after a lot of searching for different things. And I also went to Hakodate and saw the second largest statue of Perry in Japan and learned about the missing button. He had given his button as an act of kindness, and the sculptor knew about this story, and she was a Japanese woman, and she had the statue without the button. The Matthew Perry ship was involved in the tsunami release, and then since that time, I've been involved with a lot of cultural exchanges and dealing with the Nakahamas and the Whitfields. And I'm going to stop here. I know our time is up, and I want to see if there's any time for questions, and probably not because I've run a little over, but I greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight and tell you a little bit more about Commodore Perry. Thanks a lot.
Well, Dr. Perry, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, not only about Matthew Perry, but the whole Perry family being an integral part of the development of the United States and the United States Navy. That was a really interesting kind of timeline through that, all the way up until World War II and today. And then thank you for that. So I'd like to encourage anyone that has a question, go down to the question and answer button on the Zoom meeting and type in your question. And we'll be asking Dr. Perry the different questions as we're going along. I do have one initial question for you. I know you were talking about Commodore Perry, Matthew Perry, being against slavery. And was his views on that related to, you said his father and grandparents were Quakers. Did those views come down through the Quaker family traditions, or was that something he decided kind of on his own? Have you done any research on that?
I think a lot of it is based on the Quaker heritage that they had. The Perrys came to the new land in 1639. They settled in Sandwich, Mass, but then they had to leave Massachusetts because of religious persecution, the same reason they had come to this country, and they settled in Rhode Island. And it was only because of the Revolutionary War that they got away from the Quaker tradition, but they became strong Episcopalians. In fact, the family has a long history in the Episcopal Church, and they were very religious. Perry read the Bible from throughout, on every cruise he went on, and he conducted the services on board ship if they did not have a chaplain. So he was very religious. So I'd say that was his own beliefs. He believed in freedom, and one of the reasons why he wanted to go to Japan also, because he wanted to help the Japanese out in some of the problems they were dealing with.
Right. Well, we have a question. Someone who was very interested in your discussion about Key West and in that time frame. Do you know of any other reading or any suggestions for research on Key West at the time that Cuba was, claiming it? Other folks were claiming it. The piracy.
Well, interestingly, this is the 200th anniversary of the settlement of Key West. I just came back Tuesday from Key West. I go down there because I have friends there. I try to go down every year, except during this COVID problem. But there's not too much. He was only there for a short period of time. He spent 2 years chasing pirates, but he was only in Key West for a few days. He planted the flag, and that was a good thing. Commodore Porter was in charge of the squadron down there, so Porter is better known in Key West. There's no books that I know of that about Key West. I've been through the library many times, done research there, and I wrote my own article about it because it's an important part of our American history. And but there's not, in Key West, nobody really knows who he is. There is a Perry Hotel there. And I might also add that there's a Matt's Bar, and I've been to Matt's Bar a few times. So that's sort of a nice recognition of Perry being in Key West. But other than that, there's not too much known about it. But I can send, if anybody wants to contact me, I can send my article and some other references. I might send them.
All right, so we have another question about Perry's diplomacy's impact on cultural history. Is it true that Puccini's Madame Butterfly is based on Perry's diplomacy in Japan and his trip?
I've heard that. If you see, there's so many interesting sad tales. I mentioned Townsend Harris. When Townsend Harris went to Japan as the American consul, he was a single man. The Japanese don't like single men, and they found a woman to be his housekeeper. She fell madly in love with Townsend, and then when he left, she committed suicide. So that's one sad story. The other sad story was portrayed in the movie The Emperor, and that's all about the aid to MacArthur. When MacArthur went there, he did not want to kill the emperor. A lot of Americans wanted the emperor hanged, along with a lot of the generals and admirals. But at that time, he was considered divine. He was descended from the sun. And MacArthur knew this. And the sad story is the person that went out after trying to find some reason that they could save the emperor. That's a sad story about another woman that fell in love with fell in love with an American. So yeah, there's several stories. I don't really know the roots of Madame Butterfly, but I know it's a beautiful, sad tale. And when we met with the Japanese, when I was just a kid, but they had a Japanese pianist playing music from Madame Butterfly, and I remember my mother being upset because everybody was making so much noise, and she said they don't even know what they're playing on the piano, and she was pretty upset because she recognized it right away as being good music.
We have another question asking, is there a Matthew Perry statue at the Naval Academy?
No, and not that I know of. And Oliver gets more recognition. They got his portraits in the second floor of the museum. I highly recommend it. They've got a great exhibit at the museum for both Perrys, the two Commodores. And but I know of no statue there, and I don't know of any road named for him. There's a road in Japan, Perry Road. I walked on that road, and I was quite happy to see Perry Road in Shimoda, Japan. I don't know anything at the Academy. The Academy has a nice display, but that's about all I know of.
Well, Dr. Perry, thank you so much again for creating such a wonderful presentation that covers the history of really the development of the Navy with your family and all your family's interactions with the early history of the United States. I would like to remind everyone in the chat area, Dr. Perry's given his email address. So if you have any questions for him still, or want him to elaborate on some of the things that he's talked about tonight, you could send him an email. So look for that in the chat room. Once again, thank you for everyone attending the lecture tonight. And we want to also thank our sponsors, which are JP Morgan and the Homestead Gardens. We hope that you can join us again. We've got 2 more lectures left, Thursday nights. Our 7th lecture next Thursday is Measuring Milestones, Meeting Goals, Progress in Bay Restoration, presented by Ann Swanson. And in the chat, you will also see a link to sign up for that particular lecture. So I hope you can join us again on next Thursday for a wonderful environmental lecture about the Chesapeake Bay. A nice dichotomy with this. And again, hope you enjoyed our presentation this evening. Have a great night.